Welcome to Yuppies and Harpoons. I have something weird to tell you guys before we even jump into the podcast. One of the weird reasons that we have to sit here and like kind of like act like we're doing something is because we don't have an intro video yet, and Jacob and I we've been meaning to get to this, but so sometimes you'll see me like acting like I'm writing down something, and I'm not writing anything. It's bad.
I don't think, Joe, I think you gave away the secret. I think they were all convinced that these first 8 seconds were us really trying to collect our thoughts.
We adjust our socks.
Gave away the secret. We had one
fake
secret.
Sneezes.
Yeah.
No, it's bad, and we have a lot of things that we still need to tighten up on. We gotta get a good intro video. We gotta get a better script. But on the agenda today, we have a bunch of items. We're going to talk a little bit about unions because that's just Jacob's pet peeve, and he loves talking about those things. We'll dive into a little bit about something I did today, which was I got to see a presidential candidate, and we're going to segue off of that into student loans. So
the main topic being today student loans and really higher education as a whole, trying to understand the dilemma we're in, and ultimately student loan forbearance coming to an end September 30th here, what that's going to be, the impact, and why have we gotten to this point where student loan forbearance is relevant. So, but yeah, let's hop into some quick weekly updates and recap for things going on this week.
Well, the first thing, we got to keep this tradition alive, even though some of our listeners, have made fun of us for it. But what are you drinking today, Jacob?
I actually just have seltzer water, nothing exciting.
All right, moving on to unions. So, I have a Merlot here, probably in the wrong type of glass. But
what region? Where did it came from?
It's just...
Please don't say Pennsylvania.
It's Napa
Pennsylvania
Valley.
can make beer, but it can't make wine.
Yeah, it's Napa Valley.
Fair enough. Hey, you can't go wrong.
No, you can't. It's a reliable one. But the glass is actually, I got this over in Italy. We were in the Tuscany, at a winery, and we basically got some of these glasses. And so
Joe, do you have something brown on your nose? You're browning up to the wine connoisseurs of their world. Got a glass from Italy. Oh yeah. Let's sniff that
It's lovely. It's lovely. Based on how everything's been going, all I want to do right now is sniff wine. So the dog cleaned out the cat's litter box, which I thought would be a favor, and then proceeded to vomit it all up in front of my front door. And the way I found out about it was hearing my roommate call me and gag as he explained what happened. So if I could just sniff my wine in peace while I talk to you, I'd appreciate it instead of you commenting on whether or not my nose is brown. I don't even know what the hell that means. Wasp.
How's your Merlot?
It's just fine, thanks. It's great. All right, so getting back to it. So jumping into unions, there's been what looks to be a United Workers strike in the auto industry, and that's about the gist of it that I have, because I've seen these all over the headlines, and I know that we talked about unions a couple podcasts ago, and it just seemed kind of relevant since I know it's an interest of yours, but also something that we've discussed previously. What's your take on this, Jacob? Is this a good argument for why we should be pro or anti-union? And does it have anything to do with why that it's happening under Joe Biden?
Yeah, so I think to answer your question, multiple answers. So quick recap, the big three, as they call them now. So this is GM, General Motors makes Chevrolet as well, Ford, and then Stella, which owns Jeep and a number of other companies as well. There's been a lot of conglomerates built over the last few years. So this union represents workers for these big three, the largest of the United States companies. They all went on strike for the first time ever in the history of the auto worker union, over 88 years at the same time. So this is kind of a pretty big statement made by the unions saying we can go on strike at the same time and get what we want. So I think that the thing that really is to highlight is just the strength right now of workers. There's a very strong unemployment number. We're hovering around that 3.5 number, which allows for workers to have more voice, more strength, and therefore unions as well. On top of this, unions have not done a whole lot in the last 20 years. It's kind of been a low period for unions. During this time period, though, they've really built up some pretty large war chests, hundreds of millions of dollars built up to help their union workers with things like strikes and advocating for union workers. So, not anything out of the normal, but it definitely has turned political, with both Biden mentioning multiple times about Donald Trump and Donald Trump also chiming in on his take on unions. So it is a position that has gone political. They went on strike last Thursday at midnight, Wednesday at midnight, or Thursday morning. And according to my latest headlines, on Friday, they expect to kind of accelerate their strikes as well. Currently, it's pretty isolated which workers are going on strike. If demands aren't met by Friday, this will increase and further strikes will happen. The part that I'm most interested in is we've kind of seen this before in the sense of union pressures on companies, on auto companies. Famously, in the 2008 Great Recession, you saw many of the auto industry kind of falter partly because of the demands of unions historically. It was a very lucrative job to be part of the auto union. You had great benefits and, most importantly, large pensions. In 2008, when the economy crashed, those pension demands were not able to be met, therefore leading to some bankruptcies among just overall poor operations of companies, which then led to a period where auto worker unions couldn't really negotiate with these companies because of the lack of ability to meet the demands. At this point, we've kind of seen that shift where these unions now have the ability to negotiate once again because of the labor market, which gives them a lot of control, and which makes these strikes very interesting.
Yeah, well, I would certainly assume that the labor shortage gives unions just enormous leverage.
It does.
Yeah, I mean, what we have again, we probably talk about this almost every podcast now, but just the lack of children that people are having is it's slowly working itself into a massive labor shortage, and so you have unemployment at 4% and over 8 million open jobs. We're talking about massive amounts of. It just means that the average worker now either takes on they take on more responsibility, and the fact that they work for you as an employee, if you're looking for human labor, is something that is much harder to replace now. Yeah. And so I mean that's just the basic math of how unemployment, that's how it works. So, you have very, very low unemployment, you have it's much harder to replace, presumably, someone who that you would otherwise be able to find a replacement for if unemployment was very, very high. And so and so I think it's interesting. Do you think that labor unions are going to persist and get stronger and stronger as we have like a depleting labor force?
Yeah, I think that's going to be it's a trend that's definitely happening right now. Whether it's moving forward, I think it's going to be here to last for the foreseeable future, particularly as companies innovate. We are now kind of in this period where a lot of jobs can be automated,
Mm.
where just a couple years ago, that was not the case. You think about McDonald's. You went into McDonald's about 5 years ago, you were lucky if you saw a self checkout kiosk. Now, if you go to McDonald's, there will definitely be a self checkout kiosk. So that just
And you'll be
removed
lucky if you
two or
find a
three different
cashier.
cashiers, and be lucky to find a cashier. And that's the same with
Yeah.
Walmart and pretty much any other major grocery store. And there's some great benefits to that. One, self checkouts, they always show up for work, right? They don't have sick days and time off. Two, the technology is cheap enough now where it makes sense. 10 years ago, it would have cost tremendous amount of dollars to automate some of these jobs, where now it might cost only a few $100s or a few $1,000s, but over the long run, definitely pays off very quickly. There's no doubt about that. So we're seeing labor force being able to shrink through automation, while at the same time, not enough people entering the workforce. That combo, I think, is just going to allow the unions to continue to strengthen as the work demand changes. Unions are going to step in and say, "Hey, this wasn't how it used to be," and negotiate up on that. So
Well, I
it's going
think
to be
that's
very
actually a
fascinating to see
really
that.
interesting remark, because like if it costs a certain amount of money for you, if you're a company like McDonald's, for instance, 5 years ago, and it costs a lot of money, or let's say 7 or 8 years ago, and it costs a lot of money to be able to invest in these kiosks, self checkouts, and you just prefer to pay regular human employees to do the job. The thing that would actually accelerate the automation process would be raising the minimum wage and demanding McDonald's actually pay more money. And
Mhm.
so you actually have kind of a conflict of interest between automation and union incentives, where if the unions are constantly pressing for a more lucrative compensation package for their employees, they're actually pushing for labor to get closer and closer to that threshold of investment that a company would have to put into automating the position. And so
Yes.
you have to, and so in a kind of an ironic sense, unions and collective bargaining could actually you pick up the pace of automation, because automation it is you know deleting a lot of jobs, but it's currently right now it's not going fast enough,
Mhm.
because we have a massive labor shortage. And so um, the problem is that's momentum that everyone I think is very, very scared of. When you start to have AI pick up, and it's like if it can pick up a certain percentage of jobs in the economy with a certain set of abilities, um, at one rung, the next rung will probably be almost exponentially more broad. And
Yes.
so, as it gets more and more sophisticated, the breadth of its abilities is likely to encompass a lot more jobs in the economy at each interval. And so, um, that's the devil's playground right there. And so,
Yeah.
um,
Correct.
yeah. But
Yeah. And I
well,
I think that's why you're seeing this accelerating. There's been a lot of headlines for unions lately, and I think there's a reason for that. It's that kind of two-way punch there of um, automation taking place. Like, let's be honest, ChatGPT, which is kind of the consumer AI of the world, that was released less than a year ago. It was in November of 2022. It's already made mainstream impacts, and that's only going to get exacerbated. And these demands coming in for employees by unions is a two-way punch there for both sides. Um,
yeah,
but with that said, I'm not concerned about AI taking jobs and things like that. I think it's going to be similar to most technologies. Think about the invention of spreadsheets and Excel. That you can go look up headlines from the 80s where that was going to take every job and make everyone obsolete. But what it did is it actually expanded the efficiencies of workers, which then expanded the expectations of workers, which then made more jobs in the end. So, technology typically and historically has always expanded the jobs. We just don't know what those jobs are yet, which makes everyone a little bit uneven.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, but
Well, it's certainly interesting. It's absolutely a subject that we want to keep our eyes on. It certainly depends on how
certainly,
long the strike lasts, but kind of transitioning over here to, I guess, selfishly, a subject that pertains
let's
to
hear it.
me. Yeah, well, I recently had an opportunity. As some people know, I was an intern for Governor Sununu over the summer, and someone at his office kind of threw this idea at me where, the law school that I attend is right down the road from the Capitol building, and they said, why don't you, invite the governor? Like the governor hasn't been to the law school in a long time. So it'd be kind of cool, if there would be like a college Republicans or something that would, be formed that could be started. And I don't, I am a registered Republican, but I consider myself. I've never really liked stepping into the weeds on a political on a campus and being like the guy who like waves a banner for some sort of political party. I'm much more of an ideological person. Political philosophy is much more interesting to me. But um, when you hear from the governor's office that hey, he would like to show up if I was like, okay, fine, I'll go check it out. And lo and behold, there was actually no Republicans group at the at the campus, and so. I was like, all right, well, I guess we'll fire one up, and we did, and we had a student body, or student, I'm not sure what it's called, student body association or student government association meeting where basically everyone advertises their student organizations to the incoming freshman class. And so we stood out there with the table. We actually got about 60 members. We
Wow,
have it's about the incoming freshman class was about 150 people. So we got a lot of people to sign up. And I really advertised it as like a bipartisan group. I said, hey, look, this is a group that is we are a group that is a vehicle to Republican ideas. It does not mean you need to be a Republican to join. If you're simply curious about different ideas that are contrary to your own, you're also free to join. If you do agree with Republican ideas, and you're also welcome to join. And so I have some connections here locally in Concord, New Hampshire, with the Concord GOP, and they want to potentially give us backstage access to candidates like Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, but I an event that shortly after the organization was created that was happening was Asa Hutchinson came to Concord and was actually at a local venue native to Concord. Go ahead.
and ACID, yeah, this is the former governor of Arkansas,
Yes,
and he
yes,
was
Sarah.
also running for president in 2024.
Yes, yes, he's one of the Republican primary candidates. Um, And the guy coordinating the event has this thing that he invites a lot of the candidates to called Politics and Pie. And he said, yeah, absolutely. We I'll talk to the campaign and we'll see if we can get Governor Hutchinson in the green, if you can talk to him in the green room. And so turns out he agreed to it, and we got to sit down and talk to the former governor, and it was really really neat. We had about a group of maybe around 10 people show up.
Wow,
Um, it wasn't actually advertised because it was limited in the number of people who could go to the green room. Um, but it was just super cool because all of a sudden the governor walks in. You're like, that's the guy I saw at the debate. That's kind of cool. And then we got to sit down and talk with him, and he got to answer our questions, and some people were asking him about specific regulations he wanted to cut. People asked him about the climate. People asked him about student loans, and so it was really interesting seeing how like he seemed very very much engaged with students, and so he didn't it didn't look like
that's
something he
great.
just kind of reluctantly came in and did out of a duty. He looked like excited and energized to be there with us, and there were a number of Democrats that actually came and asked him questions, and they were very impressed with him.
I mean, in a way, that's what you want. Whether you agree or disagree with the candidate, you want someone who can come and be honest and open. And if they've done something, to be transparent. There's no need to be super stiff and so forth all the time. If you're a candidate, you need to be able to show that you're a human. Um,
Yeah.
so that's kind of great. But what were like maybe 2 or 3 points that he kind of focused on and explained his position on? What did you feel like his focus was?
Well, his focus largely, I mean, with us, it was kind of all over the place because there were, random questions people had written, like pre-written. But his big pitch during the event was about, the DOJ and bringing justice back to the U.S. And one of the highlights of his speech, I would say, was he said that Vladimir Putin is going around repeating the talking points of Donald Trump, saying that our what is the U.S. to talk about justice and what's right and what's wrong when it has its own political prosecutions, and that seemed to I thought it was a very compelling part of his speech where he's like we are the gold standard to the world of what it means to be a society of law and order, and to start you know basically throwing crap up against our system, tarring and feathering it,
Mm-hmm.
has real consequences. Other world leaders start to turn that around. And in fact, a very similar analogy you could use to this is just as Donald Trump has gone around and tarred and feathered our justice system, so have Democrats done when it comes to, saying that we're like systemically racist and that we're a
Mm-hmm.
country of immense, bigotry, in a way as if we're somehow uniquely terrible compared to the rest of the world, and that we're not and that we're not good. We're not a good country. We don't have good ideals that we aspire towards. That we don't have. We're not a society built upon aspirational goals for itself that it strives to
Right.
achieve. No, no, no. We're just an awful, awful society, and that's why when you see the U.S. challenge a country like China on how it treats Uyghur Muslims, they just turn around and they say, well, you see, you have a problem with systemic racism, so who are you to speak? It's like when you allow American exceptionalism to be tarred and feathered within your own country,
Mm-hmm.
um, it has real global consequences, and
Right.
so I think we need to be careful how we talk about our country. Now, I think there's also room for honest criticism of our country, but
Yes.
you have to you can't be flamboyant in how you go about it, and you have to be very precise, and you can't just talk in large generalizations and disparagements. And so
Right.
that was I would say there's a lot. There were other things he went into, but that was the part that I really resonated with.
That's awesome. Yeah. No. And I think you look at the world stage. Is the U.S. setting the example? Right now, it doesn't feel that way, at least to me myself. And you look at what the right has done and the alt right has done. Even with elections, for example, right? You have Trump denying elections in 2020, but then in 2016, you had who's now the House Minority Leader Jefferson. He denied elections as well, and it almost goes to show that there is a
Oh,
bigger
I didn't know
issue.
that. Are you
Yeah,
serious?
yeah. Election denier. Um, Hecky. So I
Hakeem
mean,
Jeffries. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hakeem
He
Jeffries.
he didn't think that Trump was legitimately elected.
Correct. Yeah, and there's a
Whoa.
number as well, on the left, and it almost and like the reason I want to bring this up, not to point fingers, but it's like everyone in DC almost feels the same, where one party shouts one thing, the other really accelerates that same talking point,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, well, we're not getting anywhere now. Now you're just like using the same thought as your opponent, and it's not advancing a country. But um, I guess to transition a little bit here, you mentioned student loans. He was obviously talking to students
Oh
for
yeah,
education, and kind of how did he, what did he bring up about that?
yeah. Well, I mean, his we only had a certain amount of time, and so I certainly wanted to press him on it. But he was asked, what his view on the student loan crisis is, because we're like something like 1.7, 1.89 or something
One point seven
trillion
eight.
dollars of
Yeah.
the student loan debt in the country. and what's his plan? And I guess that's a general question. So what's the guy going to do with that? But his initial response was, I think if you take a loan out, you need to repay it. Period. On the other hand, if the federal government has a vested interest in its citizens getting a higher education, charging them 6% interest is not something that is worth. That isn't fair. That's not something that is reasonable, a reasonable investment. And so he proposed cutting the interest rate from like 6% to 2%. He said originally he was in favor of
would that be a flat rate? Like
yeah,
everyone, no matter what, because right now it's fixed and it's set by Congress, but it's essentially
yeah. I mean, that's essentially how he presented it, was a fixed 2%.
Okay.
But he said he had thought about just getting rid of the interest rate entirely, but realized that if you have zero interest on a loan, then it's no incentive to pay it back.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I guess you could have late fees, arguably, and credit hits if you don't make your payments if you have zero interest. But
essentially, he's looking at 2% interest rate for student loans. Anything changing from, I guess, this current structure where how you can receive it?
He didn't go much more in depth than that. He did talk about the market and how students need to be. He seemed to hint that I think he was talking to law students, which I think there's a big difference between grad students and just people who get 4-year degrees in terms of like your expected income. If you get a 4-year degree, especially depending on the type of degree, educational choices have serious consequences. And so, like, getting an associate's degree, like a 2-year degree, is probably a lot more suitable for people than getting a 4-year degree. And the market adjustment there hasn't been a market adjustment that properly addresses that, if that makes sense. Yeah. Because we need more people to be going into associate's degrees rather than getting 4-year degrees. That seemed to be. That seemed to be what he hinted at, but he didn't get into that because what he was essentially saying was that 4-year degrees are very, very expensive. You need to go around. You need to let the market kind of influence your opinion. So you should shop around, find the cheapest school, and other people, they opt to go for associate's degrees. And so my interpretation of that was saying there's probably a lot of people who are seeking 4-year degrees who only need a 2-year associate's.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a
or
good
go to community college.
That's a good segue, but I think there's a lot we can dive into that, whether it's trade schools as well on top of that, whether instead of 4 or 2-year schools. But kind of the bulk of the substance tonight is kind of understanding higher education and, more importantly, student loan debt, which has relevancy because the student loan forbearance, which currently anyone with federal student loans, which is about 92% of all student loans, are federal, are not private. That forbearance, which means you have to start paying them again, starts on October 1st. So this has been suspended since early days in the pandemic. I believe it was in March of 2020 is when Trump suspended payments and no interest on student loans. And then that has been continually renewed up until this point. When Biden was elected, it was continued with the idea that a comprehensive loan forgiveness program would be presented, whether that was $10,000 student loan forgiveness or not. That was struck down in the courts. Leaves us here today with essentially a lot of the same structure going into March of 2020. But now it's been 3 years since anyone's paid student loans and had that obligations. And it's going to be kind of a fascinating thing. So looking at how we got here, what were some of the policies and so forth for why we got here, and then what are some options and solutions to correct the system and also help those who are desperately in need.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting question because you've seen that as like the U.S. is shifted from an industrialized economy into a service economy and an information economy. There's just been this instantaneous or this slow but gradual and predictable increase in people seeking higher education. And so the question is how has that been somewhat inflationary? In other words, has the interest in higher education been almost too high to the point where too many people are going to college because are in the indicators that maybe there are too many people who are going into higher education is that we have so many jobs available in the trades, which are vastly underemployed, and you have
Yep.
people going into sociology degrees where there's just not a whole lot of job opportunities, and so there seems to be some just some misallocation there. And you also see this with almost the gender imbalance of college attendance, where you have 55 to 60% of college attendance being women, and a continuous decline in male attendance in college, which I think is probably, I don't know how much we'll get into that today, but that is certainly a very interesting subject to get into at some point.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Yeah. Because so right now, just for some quick stats, collectively as the United States, we have 1.78 trillion in federal and student loan and private student loan debt. That's as of this year. And the average household with student loan debt owes $58,000. So a pretty substantial amount of dollars. Again, this is average, so it's a little skewed. But I think it's worth showing some stats here as well. So we have currently in 2020 or 2021, which is one of the last dates, the average student graduating with student loan with the average student graduating had 31,100 in student loan debt in 2021. Adjusted for inflation, to today's number, that's $36,278. That kind of is a pretty stable number for the last 10 years. The all-time high was in 2001 or 2011 with adjusted inflation adjusted numbers. So in 2011, we had the average amount was $29,049. Adjusted for inflation, that was $40,000 and $246. So we saw a peak in 2011, but since then it's kind of remained steady within that, give or take $35,000 to $40,000 range of inflation adjusted numbers. That's a pretty dramatic increase in cost of education, and therefore also in student debt, which has kind of led to this two-part problem.
Well, yeah, I think that something we have to get into is how the cost of tuition has scaled in comparison to wage increases, and because people can understand that if you're like a orthopedic or something, or if you I don't know if you work in dentistry and you come out with $500,000, or if you're an anesthesiologist, like coming out with 600. I met a guy probably I think back in 2017. I was on a plane with, and he's like, "Yeah, I have like $700,000 worth of student loans, but I'll pay that off in 2 years." I was like, "Yeah, yeah. Well, your starting salary is $450,
Well, and I think you bring up an interesting point. So we have surpassed as a country. There are over 100 individuals. It's higher than that at this point, who have over $1 million in student loan debt. So some of that is in fields that
we have 100 what? 100 individuals?
100 individuals with over 1 million in student loan debt.
Okay.
Right. I don't know what the current today date of that. I believe it's higher than that, but that was as of last year, right? We surpassed 100 individuals with 1 million in student loan debt. That's a massive amount. I can't imagine trying to dig out me as an individual in my 20s digging out of $1 million in debt. And part of that
Mm.
is compound interest, right? These people paid minimum payments for years, and while interest compounded, and now they're at $1 million. But how do you fix that at this point? But there's
Yeah,
many more examples. Less than $1 million. $1 million is just kind of a shock effect number in a sense. But
I
people
mean,
with hundreds of
I think if
thousands.
you take out $1 million in loans, if you're going to have a job that pays you 75,000 a year, then you're in deep crap.
Yeah.
But I mean, most of those, I mean, I would be willing to bet almost all of those cases are involve very very high paying medical
Well,
degrees.
the way they got $1 million in debt is from paying minimum payments and not paying principal. So it balloons
Oh,
into $1 million,
okay,
which that's the lack of education around student loan debt.
hmm.
When these individuals who are 16, 17, 18-year olds talking about how do I go to college, they're encouraged to go to college. How do I go there? They said, here's your options. Here's the schools you got accepted to, and you pick the best one because of a number of reasons, without any understanding of the financial burden that might come from it. So if you're accepting a degree in a field that pays 40,000 starting out, but you're accumulating 250,000 in student loan debt,
Yeah,
the numbers don't simply add up. If
right.
you're accepting a job as a doctor, for example, and you have 250,000 in student loan debt, but your starting income once you become a doctor is 150, and in a few years you might be making 300, 400, 500,000. 250 is not that much. You can make it
Mm-hmm.
work. There's a payoff there. But if you have a degree that the starting wage is 30, 40,000, 250 is not really feasible. And what ends up happening is it balloons through minimum payments and not paying principal, only covering interest until you get to $1 million. And that's what
Yeah,
has happened for many folks.
yeah, yeah. No, I think it kind of reminds me of the '08 crisis, housing crisis, where you had people getting mortgages from people in your profession, Jacob. Uh,
Banking.
yeah, where you had interest only loans, but in some cases, especially the ones that you were talking about. Well, I guess we should probably break it down. Basically, for those who don't know, an interest only loan, most mortgages, when you if you take out a 30-year mortgage for $250,000 house, you're going to have a monthly payment, and that monthly payment, if you multiply if all the payments that you'll make throughout the cycle of the 30-year mortgage, you'll be making 360 payments over 30 years. If you add up
Right.
all your payments, that's going to be much much more money than just the amount that you paid for the house, which is $250,000. It's going to be all of the interest as well. An interest only loan over the span of 30 years would never pay down any principal. It would never pay down any portion of your house. All it would pay off would be your interest that you owe. The advantage of it, and one of the reasons that they're used in commercial loans oftentimes, is because your payment is lower. So if you're just paying off interest off of a house, you're going to have a lower payment than if you're paying off interest in a little bit of principal. Um, the problem is that by paying off a little bit of principal in your loan, you lower the basis for which the interest rate is charged off of. And
Right.
so as that basis slowly lowers over time, you're going to have you're going to actually be paying off more and more of your principal and less amount of interest. And so over
Yep.
time, when you get to the very end of your loan, all you're going to be paying is principal, And whereas at the very, very beginning of your loan, you're almost only paying interest. The problem is that during the '08 crisis, people would just be paying interest, and then their loan would become due. Like they would they might get like a 10-year loan that was an interest only loan, and at the very end of the loan, all of a sudden the entire principal was made. So maybe they were paying for a $250,000 house. Maybe they were paying like, I don't know, $1,300, $1,500 a month in interest only. They would then have to cough up to $250,000 at the very end of the loan.
Right.
That was, and when this became, the reason that the banks were doing this was because they could get people who had enough income to pay for the interest only payment, but didn't have enough income to qualify for interest plus principal payments.
So essentially, if you make $100,000 and you have a debt to income ratio of 50%, and you had $50,000 in debt, that hits that debt to income ratio. By having interest only payments, you can instead, maybe you squeeze the payments down to only $30,000, and suddenly that ratio makes sense and can work for those individuals on paper. But the long term is that loan will balloon, which basically means at a certain day and time, you owe any remaining principal and interest payment on that loan. And so if you've only been paying interest only for a $200,000 loan for 10 years, and then it balloons, you owe $200,000 after 10 years, plus all that interest that you've been paying.
Actually, a really good way to look at it is people who flip houses. This is a perfect way to illustrate interest only loans, because it's important. I'm sorry to double down on this, but it's important that we understand what we're talking about before we get into student loan repayments and why they balloon and why they're so deadly.
Yeah.
So if I want to flip a house, this is something that my dad does. He goes and he says, "Okay, Chuck, I need $250,000. But I need the money today, and I need it in order to buy the house, and then I'm going to need the house costs $200 or $200,000, but I need $250 so that I can make $50,000 worth of repairs." What's going to happen is he's going to get $250,000, and then over the year that it takes for him to flip the house, he's going to make payments on that loan. But he's not going to pay back any part of the principal until he sells the house. So when he sells the house, hopefully he's looking for maybe to sell it for $300,000 to make a $50,000 profit. When he sells the house, he'll pay back all of the $250,000 principal. But during the course of the year where he's making improvements, the lender still wants monthly payments, and so those monthly payments are going to be interest only. So a lot of times that'll be 10%. Let's say, to make the number simple, it'd be 10% of $250,000. Which would be, on a monthly basis, it would roughly come out to, it'd be like I don't know, like 5/6. I can't do the math in my head, but it would be 10% of $250,000, which would be $25,000 divided by 12, so roughly $2,500. So that would be his monthly payment. So the problem is, regular people who are buying homes don't understand this.
Correct.
It's highly advantageous for people who are involved in real estate investing. And the same goes for people who are taking out student loans. If you have a loan where, so we were just talking about interest only loans. My understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Jacob. My understanding is that some student loans, the minimum payments actually don't even meet the interest only requirement. Meaning that if I pay, if I'm not even paying the amount of interest that I owe for my minimum payment, then the minimum interest is added on to the balloon at the end. It's added on to the amount that I owe at the end.
So
is that
essentially, what happens is, you're talking about real estate here, which is a very complex way of doing it. There's a lot of risk in real estate in the way that you're discussing, because in your house flipping situation, if your individual doesn't sell that house for more money than they put into it, they're in the hole and they have to scramble to come up with that. In the student
Right.
loan area, one, you don't have any collateral, so you're not selling anything. When you get a student loan, you don't have anything backing it up besides that degree that you may or may not get. And that's important to mention that many people don't graduate. Most people do, but not everyone. So you're basically lending against something that has no collateral, nothing that can be sold to be repaid. With real estate, if you have a house and you have debt and things go south, you can sell it and at least recoup some of it. Not all of it, but with student loans, there's nothing to sell. So you're stuck with those payments. So it almost becomes like a credit card. With most credit cards, it's about a $25 minimum payment. And what that is a trap. So credit cards, their average interest rate between 20 to 30 to 40% interest rate a month. So when you pay that minimum payment rather than the principal, you basically pay 20 to 30% interest on that amount. And eventually it compounds. That enrolls into the principal amount essentially that you owe. You owe the
Right.
bank or the lending institution that compound amount. So when you only make that minimum payment, you're only exasperating what you're doing. And this is a major, major compounding thing. You will lose if you do this. I mean, it's a simple fact. And there's individuals who times are tough and they can only make minimum payments. But the issue is these things compound and you really can't get your way out of it.
Yeah. Do you think that we're kind of looking at some policy here? Do you think it's important, or do you think it'd be a good thing to change that people can declare bankruptcy and have their student loans forgiven?
Well, I think no, because I don't completely trust the system when it comes to student loans. And let me give you some background as to why I lost trust. So college education has always been growing. The cost of it has increased more and more for decades now. It has surpassed just about every industry. It costs more to go to college now than it did for your parents, guaranteed. Um, so what happened in 2014? Obama, one of his big pushes was to reform this whole industry. What this did was transferred a lot of student loans to the Department of Education. Prior to this, it was a lot of private institutions lending student loans. So if you want to go to college, you had to go to your local bank and get a loan. Those are very difficult loans to get. Like I said earlier, they're uncollateralized. So there's nothing you can sell to repay that loan because you're just getting a piece of paper. During Obama administration, student loan debt was rising. I shared earlier that it kind of peaked in 2011 with the amount of debt that people were receiving from education. And so Obama said, we need to prioritize education. We need to make sure we have an educated workforce, which are things that are bipartisan, or at least should be. And what had happened by transferring the debt over to the Department of Education, it basically allowed like an unlimited purse for higher education. So students now had very easy access to debt, which prior to this, you had to go to a bank and get qualified. Essentially, there was some.
You're talking about the Grad Plus loans, right?
Yeah, I mean that was a major aspect to it.
Yeah.
And there was also
should we clarify a little bit what that means?
Yes, let's
like so. Yeah, so when you go to like an undergrad, when you for your initial 4-year degree, like when I was getting my finance degree, my loans were capped for what I could borrow from the federal government. There was a fixed amount that I could borrow. But you agree with it or disagree with it. While I've been in law school, there's basically this pretty much this as Jacob said, this open credit card that you can swipe that has the government's name on it, and you can borrow money for not just tuition, but you can borrow for living expenses, room and board, well beyond just paying for your tuition. And again, it's debatable, and that's kind of what Jacob's talking about right here. But this essentially is the government saying that we think it's a good idea for you to go to grad school. And it's significantly more generous than the loans that you'd receive if you're just receiving an undergraduate degree.
Right. Yeah. And that, I mean, kind of you see that shift in 2014 under the Obama administration. This was a major aspect. And they added some provisions for loan forbearance or forgiveness completely as well. So there's two different things, which I'll get to in a minute as well. But essentially what happens is you see an open door. You see it's easy to get credit, easy to get debt. And so if you can lend more, institutions can charge more. And therefore, it's the chicken and the egg scenario. Is it because institutions can charge more that you need more student loans? Or is it because we have more access to student loans that institutions can charge more? This is all at a time as well that the U.S. higher education system is a very competitive nature. There's a limited supply of positions for students to be accepted. So it creates this scarcity and allows for tuition to increase. It's simple supply and demand. There's a lot of people who want to go to college or were told to go to college, whether they wanted to or not. And there's only a certain amount of seats in the classroom for these students. You compound that with internationally, the US has the highest and the best higher education system in the world. And it means there's more demand. People internationally want to come to the US for education. It is one of our pillars as a country of strengths. You start naming top schools in the world, and nearly every single one of them will be a U.S. A school. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown. We can keep going down the list. Stanford, and maybe you get one or two like Oxford, right? That can compete to the U.S. education system. Even many of the state schools in the U.S. are top notch. Penn State, for example, or Ohio State. University of Chicago, all great schools in the world stage. So you have this like twofold effect of higher demand internationally, and then also just the access to charge more because they have access to student loans.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the twofold effect, and it has led to student loans not being corrected, even though there was an intentional movement to help individuals with student loans and the burden that it brings.
Well, so are you basically saying that, by making it much easier to qualify for student loans, like I think like about student loans, like Grad Plus loans, for instance, it's inflated the amount of people who've chosen to get into higher education?
Yeah, certainly. I mean,
that's essentially what you're...
individuals who maybe they grew up in a household, and this is no fault of their own, but they couldn't afford a 4-year degree. Maybe they went to community college, spent a few $1,000s there rather than tens of thousands of dollars, and then moved on to higher education, a 4-year degree, once they were able to save up for it. You don't see that. You see a direct pipeline then, because the access to capital, the access to the debt, essentially, that these people could take out accelerated during this time period by shifting it from private, where banks would have underwriting systems to say, can people qualify for this amount of debt, to the federal government saying, you can have this debt and we hope you repay it. If you can't repay it, you will never be able to be declared bankruptcy to get out of it. But we have some different ways of getting out of it for you.
It's really interesting though, because if you look at the incentive structure here, if you're a university, I should back it up. Like we know if you produce, 30 million additional finance degrees today, that the economy is just going to be way overinflated with people with finance degrees, right?
Right.
And so the value of the finance degree will be significantly lower. But the incentive is for universities to inflate the amount of people who have a certain degree or and go to university. And so it's like they have an incentive to make the paper that they're issuing less and less valuable, or less, or a riskier predictor of economic success, because they get to prosper off of having more and more students.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know. I'm trying to think of like the sort of policy rationales for fixing the problem, but you clearly, at least to me, have a system right now where the people who are supplying the information have a market incentive that seems to be at odds with what's best for their customers.
Yeah, and I don't fault the universities a whole lot. I think you can fault them because of the morale issue that they have helped develop. But at the same time, many of these universities are taking care of themselves. They have bills to pay, people to please, they have to stay afloat. And they were essentially given free capital. Before this, they would have had to go out, fundraise, and cold call alumni to get funds to continue to innovate their school. Under Obama, essentially what had happened was opened up unlimited supply of capital for these universities, only exacerbating the effect that had already been in place. So now these schools don't have to go out and fundraise as hard, don't have to do all this really difficult work that doesn't always pay off, because they have students who are willing to pay the tuition amount. Because these students aren't actually paying the tuition, they're receiving debt. And then eventually, post graduation, they have to think about that debt. They don't think about that debt prior to enrolling into in these universities. So ultimately, students for 4 years or sometimes 5 don't think about the debt that's accumulating. Afterwards, they are given the price tag and then have to adjust accordingly to either repay or make significant life choices to keep afloat.
Interesting.
So
Yeah, I mean that almost makes me feel like if the universities if the universities benefited from having from students having a much higher access to loans, then like I would almost be in favor of allowing for more bankruptcy or looser bankruptcy laws.
yeah, well, and just to be clear, as of now, any
Because
federal
the bankruptcy, wouldn't that provide a market check for the schools to say, we actually do need to keep in mind that even though there is like an unlimited purse here for students to take loans out, that
I
ultimately,
think it would be a check for the Department of Education. Right now, the Department of Education houses over 90% of student
yeah,
loans. If they start having bankruptcies, the system fails. Right now, you can bankrupt for everything but student loans.
yeah,
So essentially, it just allows it to continue. What the interesting part that truly scares me is about this is some of the rules under the Biden administration that's come out. So there are ways of getting out of student loans. They used to be somewhat broad, and they've been brought in more and more. So some of the examples of this is it used to be if you had 10% of your income was towards student loans, there was a path for forgiveness. That has since been reduced to 5%. Another factor is no borrower above 225% of the federal poverty level. This is about $15 minimum wage. So if you have more than that percentage, you can look for, or below that, sorry. If you have below that amount, you can look for forgiveness. It also reduced it from 20 years. So it used to be you had to pay your student loans for 20 years. That was reduced to 10 years. So there's a few other examples of this, but essentially what has happened is this problem has gotten so out of control. The courts did not uphold forbearance or forgiveness that the Biden administration proposed. And this is a major issue, and we need some pretty aggressive solutions to it. But essentially, all the solutions that have been brought forward are not viable. And so instead, they're weakening what it takes to forgive, and therefore only exacerbates the incentives that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you're going to see. I think that over the next couple of years, I mean, you're seeing some real fiscal pressures, real fiscal pressures being placed in the U.S. Specifically with student loans, but also Social Security. I think those are going to be very, very contentious issues in the near term for the political realm. Obviously the Supreme Court didn't uphold the student loan forgiveness plan, the Biden plan the plan that Biden put in place. But it is going to be interesting. There was some speculation that if the Supreme Court actually allowed that to go through, that pretty much every presidential term would turn into who's going to forgive more student loans.
Right.
Because the issue as such, I don't know, it's just so prevalent. But I think right now, maybe we should consider doing a part 2. But
I think
on this subject, yeah, because this is we haven't even touched the solutions yet, and I know that there's a lot down the pipeline with that's being considered on both sides. I know that with the Republicans, well, we need to figure out exactly where all these plans come from. But some of the ones that I was finding out about was the collateral for a degree was actually going to be the income that you made.
Yeah.
And that was something called through income share agreements, where basically supposedly this had Republican support, where you agree that you're going to pay a certain percentage of your income for a fixed number of years, and then that would be the price that you pay for your education. And there's other plans out there that I think are worth discussing the pros and the cons for.
I agree.
But right now we are at the hour, so I guess we're gonna have to probably cut this one short.
Certainly. Yeah, I think it's worth talking. Again, we didn't really touch on a lot of the solutions that are there, but those are definitely something we need to dive into, and there's plenty there to kind of fix this issue.
Yeah, definitely. Well, next week we still haven't decided what exactly we're going to be discussing. It might be a partial continuation on this conversation. It might be demographics, or it might even be something about the current political environment. So I know that we tend to rotate through multiple different subjects, but we'll see. We'll see which way the wind is blowing, and then we'll make our decision. But yeah, well, I'm excited. So tune in next week. We hope to have this podcast up again 12 p.m. Wednesday. We will be recording again next week for the same release date. So if you guys wouldn't mind giving us a like, sharing, subscribing, commenting, word of mouth, all of this stuff really, really helps. We really appreciate you guys listening.
Tattoo on your left arm. Again. Anything
mean,
works.
that does work. Getting a dog, branding it on your dog.
Yeah.
It's
Consensual
all works out well.
Consensual brands only.
Can a dog consent to being branded? I mean, that's an interesting question. For the next podcast, folks, you're listening to Yuppies and Harpoons. Again, we appreciate you listening. That is all for today. All right, Jacob, I'll see you.
See you later. Thanks.
All right. Yep.